The air inside Aurelia, a restaurant perched so high above Chicago it seemed to scrape the stars, was not merely air. It was a finely calibrated atmosphere of power, scented with aged leather, seared wagyu, and the silent, crisp aroma of 9-figure transactions. At the center of this rarefied world sat Julian Croft, a man whose ambition was as vertical as the skyscraper that housed his corporate empire. His face, etched with a severity that belied his 36 years, was a mask of cool, predatory focus. Across the polished mahogany table sat a consortium of German industrialists, their faces flushed with wine and the thrill of impending capitulation. The deal, a hostile takeover of their legacy engineering firm, was moments from its conclusion. It was the final, brutal move in a chess game Julian had been playing for months. He was a man who didn't believe in fortune or fate, only in leverage and the elegant application of overwhelming force. His heart, if he still possessed one, was a locked vault, the key lost long ago in the fiery wreckage of his childhood. Moving between the tables with a practiced invisibility was Clara. At 24, her life was a landscape of quiet anxieties and deferred dreams. Her uniform, a simple black dress with a starched white apron, was a costume of servitude. Her expression was a carefully maintained neutrality, a necessary shield against the casual cruelties and careless condescensions of the wealthy patrons she served. Inside, a storm was perpetually brewing. Her adoptive grandmother, Eleanor, the only anchor in her life, was fading, her memory unraveling due to a relentless neurological disease. The cost of her care facility was a ravenous beast, and this job, with its fleeting tips from men who wore her annual income on their wrists, was the meager shield she held against it. Clara was more than just a waitress. She was an observer. It was a skill honed by a lifetime of feeling like an outsider, of trying to understand the world by watching its inhabitants. She noticed the subtle tremor in the German executive's hand, the way Julian Croft's stillness was not calm, but coiled, like a panther waiting to strike. She had a hobby, a secret passion, born from the gaping void of her own unknown past: genealogy. She spent her spare hours in dusty library archives and on obscure ancestry websites, tracing the lines of other people's families, finding a strange comfort in the concrete histories of strangers. It was a way of pretending she had roots of her own. The final documents were signed. A low murmur of congratulations filled the space. Julian Croft allowed himself a smile so thin it was barely a crack in his granite facade. He raised his glass of Macallan 50, the amber liquid glowing like a captured sun. "To the future," he said, his voice a low baritone that cut through the ambient noise. The Germans raised their glasses in response. It was in that suspended moment of triumph that Clara approached the table to clear the dessert plates. "Excuse me, gentlemen," she murmured, her voice a soft counterpoint to the clinking of crystal. Julian barely glanced at her. She was part of the machinery of the place, as functional and unnoticed as the silverware she was collecting. She reached for his plate, her arm extending over the table. As she did, the crisp cuff of her uniform sleeve, just a fraction too loose, slid back an inch. It was a small, inconsequential motion, a flicker in the grand theatre of the evening, but it revealed the pale, delicate skin of her inner forearm. And there, etched against her skin as if drawn by an astronomer's pen, was a birthmark. It was not a random splotch of melanin. It was a constellation in miniature, 5 tiny, perfectly placed moles forming the distinct shape of Lyra, the harp, with the largest and darkest mole shining where the star Vega should be. For Julian Croft, a man who prided himself on his absolute control, The world did not slow down. It shattered. The low hum of the restaurant, the triumphant voice of the German CEO, the distant symphony of city traffic. It all ceased to exist. His mind, a fortress of cold logic and ruthless strategy, was violently breached by a tidal wave of memory, raw and agonizing. A summer afternoon in a sprawling garden, the scent of roses thick in the air. A little girl with hair the color of spun gold, laughing as he pushed her on a swing. His own younger, softer hand, tracing the strange and beautiful mark on his cousin's arm. "It's our secret star map, Amelia," he'd whispered, his 10-year-old voice filled with solemn importance. "So you can always find your way back." The screech of brakes on a rain-slicked road, the horrifying, final crunch of steel and glass, the world tumbling end over end in a dizzying ballet of destruction. Fire, the acrid smell of smoke and gasoline, his uncle's frantic shouts of her name. Amelia. He remembered the chaos, the grim-faced paramedics, the police officers trying to shield him from the sight of his parents. His aunt and uncle, his legal guardians, were dead. And his 6-year-old cousin, Amelia Thorne, who had been in the car with them, was gone. Vanished from the scene of the crash. The official theory was that she had wandered off in a daze, a victim of amnesia, and been lost to the system. A little girl with a star map on her arm, swallowed whole by the night. The Macallan glass, forgotten, slipped from his suddenly numb fingers. It did not simply fall, it plummeted, seeming to hang in the air for a heart-stopping eternity before it met the Italian marble floor. The sound was not a crash, it was a detonation. It ripped through the restaurant's opulent hush like a gunshot. Every head swiveled. The German industrialists recoiled, a spray of priceless scotch peppering their bespoke suits. Waitstaff froze, trays held aloft. Clara gasped, yanking her arm back as if she had been scalded, her eyes flying to Julian's face. She expected rage, the icy fury of a powerful man whose victory celebration had been disturbed. She saw none of it. The mask of the billionaire titan was gone, disintegrated. In its place was the face of a man seeing a ghost. His skin was ashen, his stormy grey eyes wide with a terrifying, haunted disbelief. His lips were parted, but no sound emerged. He wasn't looking at the shattered crystal or the spreading pool of amber liquid. He was staring, with an intensity that felt as if it were stripping away her very skin at her forearm. The moment stretched, taut and unbearable. The restaurant manager, a man named Philip whose entire career was flashing before his eyes, scurried over, his face a rictus of apology. "Mr. Croft, my sincerest apologies. We will attend to this at once. Are you quite all right, sir?" Julian didn't hear him. He heard a little girl's laughter in a long-dead summer. He saw a secret star map. He shoved his chair back with such violence that it screeched in protest and nearly toppled. He rose to his full, imposing height, his body trembling with a shock that went deeper than bone. A single word, a name that had been a forbidden, sacred text in his mind for 2 decades, escaped his lips in a choked, ragged whisper. Amelia. The name hung in the electrified air, an impossible accusation, a desperate prayer. Clara stared at him, her heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. She had no idea who Amelia was. But in the shattered depths of this powerful stranger's eyes, she saw a terrifying, exhilarating reflection of the question that had defined her own life. Who am I? The collision was absolute. 2 universes, separated by a lifetime of secrets and a chasm of wealth, had just violently collided on the floor of Aurelia. The fallout was just beginning. The days that followed the incident were a masterclass in controlled chaos for Julian Croft. Externally, he was the picture of command. His head of security, a calm and unnervingly competent man named Elias Vance, had managed the situation at Aurelia with surgical precision. Apologies were made, exorbitant dry cleaning bills were preemptively paid, and the German deal was finalized in a private conference room by sunrise. The official narrative, circulated with quiet efficiency among the city's elite, was that Mr. Croft had experienced a sudden, severe bout of vertigo, a plausible consequence of his relentless work schedule. But inside the cavernous, minimalist silence of his penthouse, which occupied the entire top floor of the Croft Tower, Julian was coming apart. The meticulously constructed fortress around his past, built brick by brick, over 20 years of ambition and denial, had been breached. Not by a corporate raider or a market collapse, but by a waitress with a constellation on her arm. Sleep was a foreign country. Food tasted of ash. The image of that birthmark was seared onto the back of his eyelids, a celestial map leading to a place of profound pain. He paced the length of his living room, the glittering, indifferent lights of Chicago spread beneath him like a carpet of fallen stars, while the memories assaulted him in relentless waves. He was 16 when the crash occurred, a slick, wet night in early November. They were driving back from a charity gala. He remembered his uncle, Robert Thorne, at the wheel, arguing with his wife, Julian's aunt, about some trivial social slight. In the back seat, 6-year-old Amelia was asleep, her head with its cloud of dark curls resting against the window, her small hand clutching a hand-carved wooden bird. He could still see the Lyra birthmark on her arm in the intermittent glow of passing street lights. Then, the blinding glare of headlights from a truck that had lost control on the icy overpass. The world became a cacophony of screeching tires and tearing metal. When he regained consciousness, hanging upside down, held by his seatbelt, the air was thick with the scent of rain and leaking fuel. His aunt and uncle were gone, their lives extinguished in an instant. He'd managed to unbuckle himself, his body a symphony of agony, and crawl towards the back. The rear door was twisted open like a discarded can. Amelia's car seat was empty. The little wooden bird lay on the wet asphalt 50 feet away, its wing broken. She was simply gone. The investigation had been a media circus, fueled by the immense wealth and influence of the Croft family, of which his mother had been the last direct heir. The prevailing theory was that a disoriented Amelia, suffering from a head injury, had wandered away from the chaos and been picked up by someone, perhaps a well-meaning passerby who took her to a hospital, or perhaps someone with more sinister intentions. A kidnapping for ransom was suspected, but the call never came. No demands were ever made. It was as if Amelia Thorne had dissolved into the cold November rain. The search consumed Julian's early adulthood. It consumed a significant portion of the family fortune. Private investigators chased ghosts across the country, following up on hundreds of false sightings and cruel hoaxes from people hoping to cash in on the tragedy. For years, every dark-haired little girl he saw on the street would cause a painful lurch in his chest. Over time, the world, and Julian, had been forced to move on. The investigators filed their final, inconclusive reports. He inherited the Croft empire and poured his grief, his rage, and his survivors' guilt into its expansion. Croft Industries became his armor, a monument of steel and glass built upon a foundation of loss. Every acquisition, every victory was a way to numb the hollow ache that never truly left him. He had everything a man could desire, and nothing he truly wanted. He had also become a target. Over the years, no fewer than a dozen women had come forward, all claiming to be the long-lost Amelia Thorne, all bearing crudely tattooed or conveniently ambiguous marks on their arms. Each one had been a painful, public ordeal, forcing him to relive the trauma before Elias and his team meticulously debunked their claims. The experiences had left him deeply cynical, wary of hope, and convinced that his cousin was gone forever. And now, this waitress, Clara. He sat at his vast obsidian desk, a file open on the holographic display before him. It was Elias's preliminary report. The man had been working non-stop. The file was distressingly thin. The life it chronicled a study in quiet hardship. Clara, aged 24, an orphan. The records of her arrival at the Lakeview Foundling Home were sparse. She was left on their doorstep as a toddler, approximately 2 years old, with no information other than a note pinned to her sweater that said, "Her name is Clara." She was later adopted by Eleanor, a widowed librarian who was now in a long-term care facility. Clara had no criminal record, a mountain of medical debt, and a string of service jobs. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, to connect her to the world of the Crofts and the Thorns. Nothing but the stars on her arm. "It could be a remarkable coincidence, Julian," Elias Vance said, his voice a calm, steadying presence over the secure speakerphone. Elias was more than an employee. He was the closest thing Julian had to a friend, a former intelligence officer who had been with him for over a decade. The term for it is pareidolia. The human brain is wired to see patterns, even in random data. A cluster of moles. It wasn't a cluster. Julian's voice was raw. It was Lyra. It was perfect. The shape, the placement of Vega. It was hers, Elias. He raked a hand through his hair, a gesture of profound agitation. "I see it in my nightmares. I've seen it every night for 20 years. There was a moment of silence on the line. Elias knew the story intimately. He had been the one to personally and discreetly handle the previous claimants, protecting Julian from the emotional toll. "What's your directive?" Elias asked, his tone shifting from concerned friend to efficient operative. Julian stared at a candid photo of Clara on the screen. It had been taken from a distance as she left her apartment building that morning. She had a worn tote bag over her shoulder and a look of weary determination on her face. There was something in the set of her jaw, a hint of his aunt's stubbornness, perhaps. Or was he just desperately projecting his own wishes onto the face of a stranger? Her hair was dark, like Amelia's, but her eyes, he couldn't make out their color. His cynicism warred with a terrifying sliver of hope. The past frauds had been greedy and obvious. This girl had asked for nothing. She had simply been there, a ghost at the feast of his success. "I want to know everything," Julian commanded. "Her entire life. I want to know who her friends are, what books she reads, what she worries about at night. I want you to find the person who dropped her off at that foundling home. Dig up the original police reports from the crash, the cold case files. Cross-reference every unidentified child admission at every hospital and clinic in a 200-mile radius for the 6 months following the accident. I need to know if this is a ghost, a con artist, or if she's real." "And the girl herself?" Elias asked carefully. "Clara?" Julian's CEO instinct, the cold, calculating part of him, screamed to control the variable, summon her, interrogate her, demand answers. But the 16-year-old boy still trapped inside him, the one who had lost everyone, knew that was the wrong move. If she was Amelia, she would have no memory of him. She would be a terrified stranger. If she was a fraud, a direct confrontation would be a declaration of war, giving her time to prepare her strategy. "Approach her," Julian said, his voice low and measured. "Be discreet. Find a pretense. I need one thing from her. One thing that will settle this with absolute certainty." "A DNA sample," Elias stated. It wasn't a question. Yes, Julian confirmed. My DNA is on file with the family estate. We can have the results from a private lab within 48 hours. He closed the file, the screen going dark, but Clara's face remained, a phantom image on the black glass. 48 hours. In 48 hours, he would either be reunited with the only piece of his family he had left, or he would have to bury his cousin all over again. This time for good. The hope was a poison, sweet and agonizing. It was the most vulnerable he had felt in 20 years, and he loathed it as much as he craved it. The ghost's whisper had become a roar, and it threatened to either save him or destroy him completely. The first casualty of the shattered Macallan glass was Clara's job. Philip, the manager at Aurelia, fired her the following afternoon. His apology was so profuse it bordered on pathetic, but his decision was unshakable. Mr. Croft is an institution, he'd stammered, refusing to meet her gaze. The disruption. We simply cannot afford any association with such an unpleasant incident. Clara didn't fight it. She understood the unspoken calculus. She was a rounding error in Julian Croft's world, and she had been rounded down to 0. She packed her few belongings from her locker, the meager tips from the previous night, feeling like a pittance of severance pay, and walked out into the indifferent Chicago afternoon. It wasn't just the loss of income that unsettled her. It was the billionaire's reaction. That whispered name, Amelia, had echoed in her mind ever since. It felt like a key sliding into a lock she had never known her soul possessed. Her entire life had been a jigsaw puzzle with 1,000 missing pieces. Her earliest memory was the scent of industrial cleaner and the soft, sad eyes of a nun at the foundling home. She had no history, no lineage, just a first name on a note and a constellation on her arm. Her adoptive grandmother, Eleanor, had given her a home and a heart full of love. But she could not give her a past. Now it felt as if that past was reaching for her, not with a gentle hand, but with the force of a corporate hurricane. A few days later, the surveillance began. It was subtle at first, a nondescript grey sedan that seemed to be permanently parked across the street from her modest apartment in Lincoln Park, the distinct feeling of being watched as she took the bus to the care facility to visit Eleanor. A polite, well-dressed man asking her neighbours questions about her, claiming to be conducting a tenant satisfaction survey. Her simmering unease came to a head when the man from the sedan approached her directly. She was leaving the facility, her mind heavy with the doctor's latest report on Eleanor's declining condition, when he stepped into her path. He was tall, with a calm, professional demeanour, and eyes that seemed to catalogue everything without judgment. He wasn't overtly threatening, but the quiet competence he projected was more unnerving than any physical intimidation. "Miss Clara?" he asked, his voice even and polite. "Who are you?" Clara clutched her purse strap, her knuckles turning white. "My name is Elias Vance. I represent a client who has taken an interest in your current circumstances." "My circumstances?" she repeated, a humorless laugh escaping her. "You mean my recently unemployed, drowning in debt circumstances?" "Let me guess your client." "Mr. Croft." Elias gave a slight, affirming nod. "Mr. Croft was concerned about your abrupt dismissal. He feels a degree of responsibility and wishes to make restitution." Clara's suspicion flared. Men like Julian Croft didn't feel responsible for waitresses they indirectly had fired. They erased them. "I don't want his charity," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "This is not charity, Miss Clara," Elias said smoothly. "This is a business proposal. An unconventional one." He gestured toward a small cafe down the street. "Perhaps we could discuss it over a coffee." Her instincts screamed at her to run, but a desperate curiosity and the ever-present weight of Eleanor's medical bills compelled her to agree. Inside, seated in a small booth, Elias laid out the proposition. It was as staggering as it was bizarre. Mr. Croft was prepared to offer her a sum of $500,000. It was an impossible, life-altering amount of money. It would guarantee Eleanor the best care for the rest of her life and lift the crushing burden of debt from Clara's shoulders, in exchange for one simple, non-negotiable thing: a DNA sample collected via a cheek swab. Clara stared at him, utterly bewildered. "My DNA? Why? What for?" "My client has his reasons," Elias said, his face an unreadable mask. "They are of a deeply personal nature." "Personal?" Clara's voice rose with incredulous anger. "He stares at my arm, smashes a glass, whispers some woman's name, gets me fired from my job, and now he wants to buy my genetic code for personal reasons. That's not a business proposal, Mr. Vance. That's a violation." She felt a surge of defiant pride. "What does he think I am? Some kind of lottery ticket he wants to scratch?" "Mr. Croft is attempting to find a definitive answer to a question that has haunted him for 20 years, Elias said, his tone softening almost imperceptibly. "The money is not a payment for your DNA. It is compensation for your cooperation and for the significant distress this entire situation has caused you. The funds will be placed in an escrow account to be released to you the moment the sample is provided. The payment is guaranteed, regardless of what the test results show." Clara was caught in an agonizing conflict. Her pride, her sense of self, urged her to throw the coffee in his face and walk away. But the image of Eleanor's frail, confused face, the quiet dignity with which she faced her fading memories, was a more powerful force. $500,000. It wasn't just money. It was peace of mind. It was a final, beautiful gift for the only mother she had ever known. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Then we will respect your decision," Elias replied evenly. "Mr. Croft will still provide a generous severance for your lost employment, and you will not hear from us again." It was the lack of coercion that made the offer so insidious, so tempting. He wasn't forcing her hand. He was simply laying out the choice, her privacy or her grandmother's security. For Clara, it was never really a choice. "Fine," she said, the word tasting of surrender. "I'll do it. A nurse can meet you at a private medical clinic of your choice tomorrow morning," Elias said, nodding. As she left the cafe, Clara couldn't escape the chilling sensation that she had just sold the very last piece of her unknown identity. Meanwhile, news of the dramatic incident at Aurelia, despite Elias's carefully managed cover story, had rippled through the city's upper crust. It reached the ears of Marcus Thorne, Julian's maternal uncle and a senior executive at Croft Industries. Marcus was a man who wore his familial devotion like a bespoke suit, but beneath the polished veneer, his heart was a knot of envy and secrets he'd harbored for decades. He had always lived in the shadow of Julian's mother, the true Croft heir, and after her death, he'd been relegated to a secondary role, watching her son inherit the empire he felt should have been his. He had played the part of the supportive, grieving uncle masterfully. He had publicly overseen the search for his own daughter, Amelia, his face a mask of paternal anguish for the news cameras. But secretly, her disappearance had been a twisted kind of salvation. With his wife and Amelia gone, the enormous trust fund established for his daughter, a fund he managed, had become his personal piggy bank. For 20 years, Marcus had been carefully, brilliantly siphoning millions from that trust, funding a secret life of high-stakes gambling and disastrous investments. Amelia being declared legally dead would have been ideal, but the ongoing search provided him perfect cover. The news of a waitress with a specific birthmark shaking his nephew to his core sent a bolt of pure, cold terror through him. He made a few discreet calls. He learned about Clara's firing, about Elias Vance's quiet investigation, and, most horrifyingly, about the impending DNA test. Panic, sharp and suffocating, gripped him. If that girl was Amelia, his life was over. The embezzlement, the decades of lies, it would all come out. He faced not just financial ruin and public disgrace, but a long prison sentence. He had to stop it. He couldn't prevent the test itself. That would look too suspicious. But he could control the result. Using a burner phone, he dialed a number he prayed was still active. It connected him to Dr. Alistair Finch, the director of a prestigious private genetics lab, a man whose own ruinous gambling addiction had once placed him squarely in Marcus Thorne's debt. "Finch," Marcus said, his voice a low, venomous hiss, "I have a job for you, a matter of the highest sensitivity. I'm going to need a specific test result to come back negative. Absolutely, unequivocally negative." The ghost of Amelia Thorne wasn't just a threat to Julian's peace of mind. It was a wrecking ball aimed at the fraudulent foundation of Marcus Thorne's entire existence, and he would burn the world down to keep it from hitting its mark. The clinic was a sterile, anonymous facility in a quiet downtown building, selected for its absolute discretion. Clara sat on the edge of a padded examination table, the crisp paper crinkling beneath her. A briskly efficient nurse had taken the 2 swabs from the inside of her cheek, the entire process lasting less than 3 minutes. 3 minutes to sell her biological signature for a fortune. As the nurse sealed the samples into a biocontainer, labeled with a long, impersonal alphanumeric code, Clara felt a profound sense of emptiness. Elias Vance was waiting in the reception area. He handed her a tablet displaying a legal document confirming the transfer of $500,000 into the escrow account she had designated. The numbers shimmered on the screen, a digital promise of a life free from financial terror. "Thank you for your cooperation, Miss Clara," Elias said, his expression as impassive as ever. "As per our agreement, you will be notified of the results, after which you will not be contacted again." Clara merely nodded, unable to form words. She walked out of the clinic and into the bustling city, feeling more anonymous than ever, like a ghost haunting her own life. The money was a lead weight in her soul, a source of both profound relief and suffocating shame. For Julian, the subsequent 48 hours were a form of exquisite torture. He barricaded himself in his penthouse, cancelling all appointments, refusing all calls except those from Elias on the secure line. The cynical armor he wore every day had been stripped away, leaving him raw and exposed. The hope he had suppressed for years was now a raging inferno. He allowed himself, for the first time in 2 decades, to imagine it, telling Amelia about her parents, about his parents, showing her photographs, sharing the fragmented, precious memories of their shared childhood. He imagined the end of the profound, crushing loneliness that had been his constant companion. The possibility was so beautiful, it was physically painful. The sample, transported by one of Elias's most trusted couriers, arrived at the Meridian Genetics Laboratory. It was logged, processed, and assigned to a senior technician. But before the analysis sequence could be initiated, Dr. Alistair Finch intercepted it. Finch was a man drowning in the sweat of his own bad choices. Marcus Thorne's call had resurrected a dread he thought he had long since outrun. The debt he owed Thorne wasn't monetary. It was a debt of silence and complicity, and Marcus was calling it in. With hands that trembled slightly, Finch accessed the lab's secure server. He located Julian Croft's DNA profile, on file from a comprehensive executive health screening years prior. He then located the incoming sample from the anonymous donor, Clara. The deception was terrifyingly simple. He didn't need to run the comparison at all. He just needed to build a convincing forgery. He pulled up a standard kinship analysis report template. He fabricated the allele data, carefully inputting markers that would show zero commonality. He double-checked the sample identification codes to ensure they matched perfectly. Then, with a final sickening click of the mouse, he generated the official report. Comparison of Y-ester and mitochondrial DNA markers. Conclusion: the probability of a first-cousin relationship between subject A, Croft J, and subject B, Doe C, is 0.07%. The subjects are genetically unrelated. He encrypted the file and sent it to Elias Vance's secure email address. Then, with another series of keystrokes, he permanently erased the raw data logs from Clara's sample. It was as if it had never been processed. He leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding a frantic tattoo against his ribs. It was done. The notification chimed on Julian's phone like a funeral bell. He opened the encrypted email from Elias. The report was attached. His hands were unsteady as he tapped the file open. He didn't need to decipher the complex genetic data. His eyes went straight to the conclusion. The cold, clinical words stark against the white background. 1000%. Genetically unrelated. The inferno of hope was instantly extinguished, leaving behind nothing but cold, black ash. The penthouse, which moments before had felt electric with possibility, was suddenly a vast, silent mausoleum. He didn't shout. He didn't break anything. The titan of industry, the master of the universe, simply collapsed inward. The grief he had held at bay for 2 days returned with the force of a tidal wave, dragging him down into the crushing depths. It was worse than before. Before, there had always been the faint, shimmering mirage of the unknown, the what if. Now there was only the brutal, unforgiving certainty. She wasn't Amelia. She was just a random waitress with a coincidental pattern of moles on her arm, a cruel, cosmic joke played on a desperate man. The pain was so acute, so physical, it felt like the car crash was happening all over again. His profound sorrow quickly curdled into a familiar, protective rage. He had allowed himself to be vulnerable. He had opened that door to the past, and a howling wind had swept through, chilling him to the marrow. He felt like a fool, and his anger, with no other target, settled on the image of the waitress, Clara. He knew, on a rational level, that she had done nothing. She hadn't sought him out. He had hunted her down. But in the wreckage of his mind, her face was now inextricably linked to this new, deeper layer of devastation. She was a living monument to his foolish hope. He picked up the phone and dialed Elias, his voice a flat, dead thing, devoid of all emotion. "It's over. Julian, I'm so sorry," Elias began, his voice filled with genuine empathy. "Don't be," Julian cut him off. "It is what it is. Finalize the payment to the girl. Include an additional 100,000 for the emotional distress. Draft a non-disclosure agreement, so airtight that she can't even think her own name without consulting a lawyer. Make it crystal clear that if she ever attempts to contact me, or anyone associated with me, for any reason, I will unleash the full legal might of this corporation and ruin her. Is that understood?" "Understood," Elias said, quietly. "And Elias," Julian added, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "delete her file. Erase every piece of research we did. I never want to see her name or her face again." Clara received the legal documents and the final confirmation of the funds the next day. The language of the NDA was a dense forest of legalese, but the message was a clearing in the center. Take the money and cease to exist. A single, blunt sentence, confirmed that the DNA test was negative. She was not who he thought she might be. A part of her, a small, foolish part she hadn't dared acknowledge, felt a strange pang of loss. For one brief, insane moment, she had wondered if she might finally have a place to belong, but that feeling was quickly overwhelmed by a tidal wave of relief. The ordeal was over. She was free, and she was, by any measure she had ever known, wealthy. The first thing she did was call Eleanor's primary care physician and arrange for her to be moved to a top-tier memory care facility, a place with gardens and art therapy, and a level of care that had previously been the stuff of fantasy. She signed the papers, took the money, and obediently vanished from Julian Croft's world. Julian went back to building his empire, his heart now encased in a fresh layer of impenetrable ice, and in his corner office, Marcus Thorne poured himself a celebratory glass of vintage scotch, believing he had successfully buried a ghost for the second and final time. The deception was absolute, and the truth lay dormant, a seed buried under 20 years of lies, waiting for an unexpected rain to bring it to life. 6 months passed. Chicago cycled through its seasons, from the biting winds of winter to the tentative bloom of spring. Life, as it is relentlessly determined to do, moved on. For Clara, the world had been remade. The money from Julian Croft, which she privately called the ghost payment, had been a miracle. Eleanor was thriving in her new home. The constant, gnawing anxiety about finances that had been the soundtrack to Clara's life had faded to a whisper. She no longer had to work double shifts, her body aching with exhaustion. For the first time, she had the luxury of time. She enrolled in online courses, not for a practical career, but for herself. She studied history, art, and, most avidly, advanced genealogical research techniques. Her hobby became her mission, with the void in her own history now a sealed, settled question. She was nobody. The DNA test had proven it. She poured her energy into solving the puzzles of others. She even began volunteering for a non-profit that helped adoptees find their birth families, her skills at navigating archaic records and connecting disparate data points proving remarkably effective. Yet a quiet disquietude remained. The negative DNA test should have been a period at the end of a sentence, but it felt more like an ellipsis. Why had a man as cold and logical as Julian Croft been so utterly convinced? What had he seen in the stars on her arm that had shattered his composure so completely? The name Amelia was a phantom that occasionally drifted through her thoughts, a name that felt both alien and achingly, inexplicably familiar. One afternoon, while digitizing old intake records for the non-profit, she stumbled upon a familiar name, the Lakeview Foundling Home, her own first home. On a whim, she pulled up the records for the year she was left there. The entry was sparse. Female child, approx. 2 years old, left on steps November 8th. Note attached. Her name is Clara. November 8th. The date sparked something. Using her access to professional newspaper archives, she ran a search for major events in the Chicago area during the first week of November, 20 years ago. The screen filled with headlines, and there it was, a story from November 5th. Croft heiress, husband killed in fiery overpass crash, niece, 6, missing from scene. Her blood ran cold. She read the article, her heart pounding a slow, heavy drumbeat. It detailed the accident, naming the victims as Robert and Elizabeth Thorne. It mentioned the sole survivor, their nephew, 16-year-old Julian Croft, and it spoke of the missing child, their daughter, 6-year-old Amelia Thorne. A photo, grainy and black and white, showed a smiling, dark-haired little girl. The dates were too close. A catastrophic accident where a child vanishes on November 5th. An unidentified child of roughly the right age appears at an orphanage 3 days later on November 8th. It could be a coincidence. Chicago was a massive city, but it was a coincidence that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She felt a pull, an obsessive need to know more. This wasn't about money or a fantasy of being a long-lost heiress anymore. This was about the truth. This was about the little girl in the photograph. She began to dig, not as a potential claimant, but as the researcher she had become. She filed requests for the declassified police reports on the cold case. She spent weeks poring over microfilm of local news coverage from the time, cross-referencing witness statements and timelines. Most of it was a dead end. But then she found it, buried deep in a supplemental report from a responding officer. It was a small detail, deemed irrelevant at the time, an inventory of items found scattered at the crash site. Along with vehicle debris and personal effects, the officer had noted 1-1. Child's toy, carved wooden bird, dark wood, approx. 4 inches in length, left wing appears to be broken. The words seemed to leap off the page and strike her like a physical blow. A sudden, blinding flash of an image exploded in her mind. Not a thought, but a fully formed sensory memory. The feel of smooth, cool wood in her small hand. The specific, jagged edge of a broken wing under her thumb. The scent of rain and something sharp, like gasoline. The sound of a woman's voice, humming a soft, simple tune. The lullaby. It was a melody that had haunted the edges of her memory her entire life. A wordless tune she would hum to herself when she was anxious or sad. She had always assumed it was something she'd heard at the orphanage. Now she knew it wasn't. It was older. It was hers. Across the city, in the sterile, climate-controlled quiet of the Croft Tower, Elias Vance was also wrestling with the past. He was a man who lived by facts and evidence, and the lab report had been a fact. He had obeyed his employer's orders and deleted the Clara file. But a good intelligence officer never truly deletes anything, and he never trusts a situation that resolves itself too perfectly. Something had been gnawing at him. Marcus Thorne. Julian's uncle had been too relieved, too effusive in his comfort after the negative result. He'd clapped Julian on the back, proclaiming that it was for the best, that it was time to let Amelia's ghost rest. It felt false, theatrical. On his own time, using his own resources, Elias began a deep dive, off-the-books inquiry. He didn't investigate Clara. He investigated the lab. He ran a full financial and security audit on its director, Dr. Alistair Finch. He found a history of significant gambling debts, most of which had been mysteriously paid off by an untraceable offshore entity several years ago. A dead end. He shifted his focus to Marcus Thorne and the Amelia Thorne Trust. As head of security, Elias had a certain level of access to corporate financials. He couldn't see the granular details of the trust, which Marcus managed with an iron fist, but he could see the quarterly earnings reports filed with the main Croft estate. For years, the fund had posted suspiciously anemic returns, often reporting minor losses even in bull markets. The official line was a highly conservative capital preservation strategy. Now it looked less like caution and more like a cover for a slow, methodical drain. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. He put a quiet flag on Finch's financials just in case. Months later, it pinged, a recent large cash deposit into a new personal account. It was made 2 days after the DNA results had been delivered to Julian. The amount was $100,000, the exact sum of the emotional distress bonus Julian had authorized for Clara. Elias felt a surge of ice-cold fury. Marcus hadn't just paid off Finch to fake the results. He'd used Julian's own money intended as a final, dismissive payment to a woman he believed was a stranger, as the first installment of the bribe. It was motive. It was means. It was opportunity. He still didn't have definitive proof of tampering, but he had a web of corruption so damning it was practically a confession. He knew he couldn't go to Julian with this. The emotional wound was too deep. Julian would see it as a cruel fantasy. He needed something irrefutable. He needed to break Finch. The whispers of the past were no longer whispers. For the woman who had lost her memory and the man paid to protect secrets, they had become a deafening roar. Elias Vance moved with the quiet, inexorable patience of a glacier. He didn't confront Dr. Finch in a parking garage. His methods were more refined. He arranged for an anonymous, untraceable data packet to be delivered to Finch's home computer. It contained just 3 things: screenshots of the wire transfers from Marcus Thorne's Shell Corporation that had settled his old gambling debts, a satellite photo of Finch meeting with Thorne in a secluded park a week before the DNA test, and a copy of the deposit slip for the $100,000 cash payment. There was no message, no threat. None was needed. 24 hours later, a terrified Alistair Finch called the private number Elias had provided at the bottom of the email. They met in a soundproofed room in a discreet corporate hotel. Finch, his scientific arrogance stripped away to reveal a core of sniveling fear, confessed everything. He told Elias how Marcus had blackmailed him, how he had been instructed to falsify the report, how he had deleted the raw data. "He said it was a kindness," Finch stammered, sweat glistening on his upper lip. "He said Julian needed closure, that chasing this ghost was destroying him. He said the girl was an opportunist who would bleed the family dry." Elias recorded every self-serving, pathetic word. He now had the weapon he needed. He immediately left for Croft Tower, the confession a ticking bomb on his encrypted phone. At the very same time, a new, unshakable resolve had taken root in Clara. The memory of the wooden bird, the lullaby. It was more than a clue. It was proof. It was her truth, a truth that resonated in her bones, more real and more certain than any lab report. She knew the NDA she had signed was a legal minefield. She knew she risked financial ruin and public humiliation. But the truth was more valuable than money, more important than safety. She had to know. She had to look Julian Croft in the eye and present him with a history he couldn't deny. She dressed carefully, not in a waitress uniform, but in a simple, professional navy blue dress. She took a taxi to the financial district, the Croft Tower looming over the city like a shard of black glass. It was designed to intimidate, to make anyone at its base feel insignificant. The old Clara would have been too terrified to even approach the lobby. But the woman who had meticulously pieced together her own stolen past was not the old Clara. She walked to the imposing main security desk, her heart a steady, determined drum against her ribs. "I need to see Julian Croft," she said, her voice even and clear. The guard, a formidable man with a perpetually bored expression, gave her a dismissive once-over. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Clara admitted, "but it's a personal matter. It is extremely urgent. Please just tell him that Clara is here, and tell him I found Amelia's bird." The guard was about to deliver a standard refusal when his earpiece crackled. He listened, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly. He looked at Clara with a new, baffled respect. "Ma'am," he said, his tone utterly transformed, "Mr. Vance, head of security, says to send you right up." The elevator ride to the penthouse floor felt like an ascent into the heavens. The doors opened into a silent, impossibly vast reception area. Elias Vance was waiting for her. His face was grim, but as he looked at her, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, not pity or suspicion, but a kind of pained acknowledgement. "Miss Clara," he said, "he's in his office. He doesn't know you're here. But he needs to see you." He led her down a long, art-lined corridor to a set of towering oak doors. He pushed one open and gestured for her to enter. Julian was standing with his back to the door, hands clasped behind him, staring out at the city he ruled. He looked leaner, the sharp angles of his face more pronounced. The last 6 months had not erased the shadows from his eyes. "Elias, I told you I was not to be disturbed," he said, his voice cold and weary, without turning around. "There's someone you need to see, sir," Elias said, his voice taut with a strange mix of deference and command. "I urge you to listen to what she has to say." Julian turned slowly, his face a mask of irritation that instantly froze into a compound of disbelief and pure, unadulterated rage when he saw Clara. "Get her out of here," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "She is in direct violation of a legally binding contract. I will have her sued into oblivion. Elias, remove her now." "Julian, wait," Elias pleaded. "Just listen." "There is nothing to listen to." Julian's voice rose, cracking with the carefully buried pain. "The test was negative. She is a fraud who took my money, and now she's back for more. She is nothing to me. Now get her out." Clara's courage wavered under the blast of his fury. Her hands trembled. But then she thought of the little girl in the photo, of the broken wooden bird. She took a step forward. "The test was a lie," she said, her voice shaking but clear. Julian let out a harsh, barking laugh of pure contempt. "Of course it was. Let me guess. You found a long-lost diary, a bribed nurse. How much is it this time? 1 million? 5? Tears of frustration and hurt welled in Clara's eyes. "I don't want your money," she choked out. "I never did." She reached into her purse and pulled out, not a locket, but a thick file folder. She opened it on the edge of his desk. "I am a genealogist. It's what I do. And I have spent the last 6 months researching a missing child named Amelia Thorne." She laid out the documents with methodical precision, the police report, the news clippings, the orphanage intake form. A child disappears on November 5th after a traumatic accident. An unidentified child appears 3 days later. The timeline is a match. Julian stared, his face a storm of conflicting emotions, but his anger still held sway. Coincidence and circumstantial nonsense. It proves nothing. "You're right," Clara said, her voice growing stronger. "This proves nothing." She closed the folder. "But memory does." She looked him directly in the eye. "I remember the feel of a wooden bird in my hand. I remember the sharp edge where the wing was broken. And I remember a voice, a woman's voice, my mother's voice, humming a song. And then, under the immense pressure of the moment, the fear and the hope and the desperate need for him to believe, she began to hum. A soft, simple melody, the wordless lullaby that had been the only true inheritance from her past. The sound struck Julian like a physical blow. It was his aunt's lullaby, a simple tune she had composed herself, one she only ever sang to her daughter, Amelia, a melody he hadn't heard in 20 years, but one that was etched into his soul, the final wall of his cynicism, the fortress he had spent 2 decades building, did not just crack, it vaporized. The truth, undeniable and overwhelming, washed over him. He stared at her, at the constellation on her arm, at the fierce, determined truth in her eyes, and he heard the ghost of his aunt singing to her child. "The bird," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It had a name. I carved it for you. Do you remember its name?" Clara closed her eyes, and from the deepest, most hidden recess of her memory, a single word surfaced. "Pip," she breathed. The unraveling was absolute. The rage in his face dissolved, replaced by a raw, gaping wound of grief and disbelief and a dawning, miraculous joy. "Amelia," he choked out, the name no longer a ghost but a reality. He stumbled forward, not as a CEO but as a boy who had lost his family, and pulled her into a fierce, desperate embrace, burying his face in her hair. He was holding his cousin. He was holding the last piece of his past. He was no longer alone. Just then, Elias stepped forward, holding up his phone. On the screen was Dr. Finch's tearful, recorded confession. "The test was falsified, Julian, on your uncle's orders." Julian's grief instantly hardened into a cold, diamond-hard fury. He didn't release Amelia, but kept one arm wrapped around her, a protective, possessive gesture. With his other hand, he stabbed a button on his intercom. "Get me Marcus Thorne, in my office. Now." When Marcus arrived, radiating his usual oily charm, he froze in the doorway. He saw his long-lost, supposedly non-existent niece held in his nephew's embrace. He saw the damning confession playing on a large screen behind the desk. He saw Elias Vance standing by the door, his expression like that of a stoic executioner. Marcus Thorne's world ended, not with a bang, but with the quiet, final click of the office door sealing him inside with his crimes. His pathetic denials and desperate appeals to family were met with a silence more terrifying than any shouting. "This," Julian said, his voice lethally calm as he pulled Amelia closer, "is my family." He nodded to Elias, who opened the door to reveal two uniformed Chicago police detectives waiting in the corridor. In the weeks that followed, the story of the lost Croft heiress became a media sensation. But Julian shielded Amelia from the storm, creating a sanctuary for her to heal. He ensured Eleanor received a lifetime of the best care, and Amelia visited her every day, sharing pieces of her newfound past with the woman who had given her a future. The process of becoming Amelia Thorne was not instantaneous. It was a slow, quiet journey of rediscovery. Julian and Amelia spent hours in the family archives, looking at old photographs and home movies, piecing together the life that had been stolen from her. He learned to be not just a guardian, but a cousin, a friend. She taught him how to laugh again. She never abandoned the name Clara, the name Eleanor had given her. She kept it as a middle name, a reminder of the quiet, resilient woman she had been forced to become. With her portion of the now-recovered trust fund, she established the PIP Foundation, a non-profit with a singular mission: to provide funding and expert genealogical research for adoptees and others with unknown histories, helping them find their own truth. One clear summer evening, they stood on the penthouse balcony, an old brass telescope, a family heirloom, pointed towards the night sky. Julian adjusted the lens, focusing on the brilliant star, Vega, and the constellation that surrounded it. "I remember you telling me my birthmark was a secret map," Amelia said softly, her voice filled with a peaceful wonder. Julian looked away from the eyepiece and at his cousin, her face illuminated by the city lights and the distant stars. A genuine smile, the first truly unguarded smile in 20 years, transformed his face. "It was," he replied, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "It was always meant to lead you back home." A story that began with a shattered glass and a broken trust ended with a family reforged, stronger than ever. Julian Croft, The man who commanded the world but had lost his soul found it again in the cousin he thought was gone forever. And Amelia Clara Thorne, the woman who had no past, discovered a history richer than any fortune, and a future where she could finally, truly, belong. Their journey was a testament to the enduring power of memory, the resilience of family, and the simple, profound truth that even after the longest, darkest night, the stars will always be there to guide you home.